Okay, so the last thing is types of errors. So just like in a court of law, when someone could prove someone is guilty, there's always a chance that they might be wrong. There's always a chance that that person might be not guilty. It depends on the case of like some evidence is much better than others. And sometimes it's very clear that the person is guilty, but a lot of times there's always room for error. And so the same thing is true for hypothesis testing. Where there's always room for error, and it could just be that that one sample ended up being a really large outlier, which was very unusual, and not that the null was actually false. So these errors we call it's a type 1 or a type 2 error. Okay? So a type 1 error occurs when we reject H naught, the null hypothesis, H sub 0, when it's actually true. So we reject a true null hypothesis. A type 2 error occurs when we don't reject the null hypothesis, but it was actually false. So we should have rejected it. Okay, so a type 1 error again occurs anytime we reject. There's a possibility that we were wrong. And if we reject the null, we believe when we reject the null, we believe it is false. And so the error would be that if it's actually not false, it's true, then we made the wrong decision and we shouldn't have rejected it. And a type 2 error is the opposite. It occurs whenever we do not reject. So if we fail to reject the alternative, fail to reject the null, but it actually was false. And so when we fail to reject, we believe, or again, there's not evidence the null is true, okay, or there's not evidence that it's not true. But if we're wrong, then the null is actually false and we were wrong. Okay. And so sometimes this table helps, and again, this usually is really confusing for students, but when we have a decision, there's 4 possibilities. So if we reject the null, which means we're saying that the null is false, that it's wrong. Okay, when we reject the null, we're saying, okay, the null is not true. If the null is true, we have a type 1 error because we were wrong. If the null is false, then we were right, and that was the correct decision. When we fail to reject, we think the null is true, right, or not false. And again, null is H sub 0. So if we fail to reject the null, and the null is true, then we made the correct decision. But if we fail to reject the null and the null is false, then we have a type 2 error. And usually a type 1 error is more serious than a type 2 error. This is because a type 1 error results in a false conclusion. So generally speaking, again, it would probably depend on the crime, but usually we would think, especially if it's a minor crime, convicting a guilty person is worse than letting a guilty person go free. I can know in some extreme cases, that would probably not be true. You have like a serial murder or not, but a lot of times it's believed to be worse. So most of the time, like a type 1 error is considered worse because it's a false conclusion. While a type 2 error means that we don't have evidence against the null and we're not really making a new conclusion at all. So that's why the p-value is based on that significance level, and the significance level is the probability of making a type 1 error. And so again, we want the type 1 error to be really small, which is why our significance level is usually 10% or below. And that would again be the probability of making a type 1 error. Okay, so again, this is like the confusing part, and then we're going to try to do a few examples. So we want to decide if we have a type 1 error, a type 2 error, or correct decision in each of these cases. A test is made and the null is that mu is equal to 100 and the alternative is mu does not equal 100. Okay. So the true value of mu is 150 and the null is rejected. So this is the first thing we have to think about, okay? If the null is rejected, we think the null is false. Okay, so we think mu equals 100 is false. Okay, so anytime we reject, we think that's false. And when we reject, we have the option of making a type 1 error. That's the only error. You can never make a type 2 error if you reject. So if we reject, there's a possibility of type 1 error. So we pretty much have to decide, did we make a type 1 error or did we make a correct decision? So if the null is false, we want to see, is that true or not? So the true value is that mu is 150. Okay, and so we thought mu was 100. If mu was 150, that means the alternative is true and the null is false, okay, because it's wrong. And that's what we concluded when we rejected. So this was the correct decision. So when you're doing these problems, you want to figure out, okay, what did we conclude? And if we concluded, or whatever we concluded, was that correct or incorrect? And then if it was incorrect, you can just figure out the type of error based on whether you rejected or not rejected. It's my whole idea of when doing these. So let's look at another example. B, a test is made and H sub 0, or the null, is mu equals 18, and the alternative is that mu is greater than 18. Okay, the true value of mu is 20 and H naught is not rejected. Okay, so again, if it's not rejected, we think the null is true. Okay, if we don't reject it, we think the null is true. Okay, and if we not reject, the only possible error is a type 2. You cannot get a type 1. So we just have to figure out, are we right or not? So the true value of mu is 20. Okay, so mu is actually 20. But we thought that the null was true. So we believed mu was 18. And so we were wrong. Okay, because it actually wasn't 18, it was greater than 18, it was 20. Okay, and so if we do not reject, which is the same as failing to reject, and we're wrong, it is always a type 2 error. And so this is a type 2 error because we were wrong and we did not reject. Okay. Okay, so C, a test is made, the mean is 3. The alternative is that the mean is less than 3. The true value of the mean is 3. And we rejected the null. Okay, so again, if we reject, we think the null is false. So we think mu equals 3 is false. Okay, but they said that actually mu is 3. Okay, so we were wrong. And if we're wrong and we reject, it is a type 1 error. So we made a type 1 error. And I really think that's how you have to think through these problems. And they're not easy because you have to think multiple steps, but that's how these work. Okay. So I want you to pause and try these 2 problems. These are a little bit harder because they don't write it in symbols and they describe it in the problem. But I want you to try these 2. And I'm gonna see how you do with them on like kind of quiz questions, but then we will also go over these 2 in class.